All right, I'm going to go through the Francis Bacon reading. And I know and I'm going to go through the first part, and I'm going to ask you guys to all finish it up a little, finish it up to the end, because it really does set the foundation of what is today's scientific reasoning. What you don't want to do is go, oh, it's from the Renaissance. He didn't know what he was talking about. He probably had an iPhone too. It's not that simple. You're going to see that science is a philosophically based practice, as are all fields. And you're going to see that here with much of what you think is science was actually spelled out first by Francis Bacon. And it's even more complicated than you might think. He did write this originally in Latin back in 1620. And again, he was, rubbing shoulders with people like Isaac Newton and William Shakespeare and all them. And that was really a time period of a revolution in thought. How thinking was done was entirely revolutionized as from before to after. Francis Bacon was one of the primary men pushing thinking to go in an entirely different direction. And pick up new types of research, new types of thinking about how the world works. And yeah, he had to do this. Much of this debate was actually based in misunderstandings about the nature of Aristotle and Plato. Since the Greeks, ancient Greek philosophy, was something that everybody who was educated in this time period had to have read. In the original, most certainly. You didn't have lots of translations floating around in English of these works. And the works would have primarily been the Greek philosophers, Plato and Aristotle. Bacon is coming out of a tradition more founded in Aristotle than in Plato. And that was one of the basic distinctions that have been made all along. And let's go through it, okay? So he did revolutionize things, but he did it standing on a stage built by Aristotle. And let's go through it, okay? And here we go. This is page 5. And at first it's going to go a little slow. Man, being the servant and interpreter of nature, can do and understand so much, and so much only as he has observed in fact or in thought of the course of nature. Beyond this, he neither knows anything nor can do anything. What he's starting off with is setting a basic foundation of modesty to scientific thinking. That's what he's saying. You cannot just figure things out, no matter how intensively you think. And that's very important for scientific reasoning. So he's setting a foundation, and you're going to see this come up in Karl Popper, a foundation of modesty within the thinking itself. You cannot go further than that. And calling man the servant and interpreter, in other words, the person who's speaking is nature, him or herself. And notice that he relies on a metaphor to get that idea across. You remember with Plato, he used a metaphor or an allegory to get his ideas across. So in a real way, Bacon is well versed in the language of literature, and he's starting it off with a metaphor in order to give insight. So you, as a scientist, are an interpreter. You're a servant. You're a servant of nature. So it's very important to understand the modesty built within the position itself. Okay? Let's jump up a little bit. The subtlety of nature is greater many times over than the subtlety of the senses and understanding, so that all those spacious meditations, speculations, and glosses in which men indulge are quite from the purpose, only there is no one by to observe it. What he's pointing out is that nature is far more complicated than the human mind can understand. That little phrase you've heard me repeat, the world is more complicated than you want it to be, that's me paraphrasing Bacon. You should never think that you truly understand things. And this is, well, obviously you don't want to assume you're stupid. That would be a waste of time. But there is always in knowledge, there is some element that is not understood, that is yet to be determined, that hasn't been figured out. The element that isn't understood might overturn all of the knowledge you've gained. It very might. It's been called more recently a paradigm shift. These things do happen at various points. Einstein was a paradigm shift for physics. Okay. And then, getting to string theory and things like that would be paradigm shifts. You can overturn things, but usually it's not done just through thinking about it. When he calls it spacious meditations, in other words, you don't figure out how the world works by just thinking it through or just coming up with ideas, and maybe it could be. So you need to go through observation. Is no one by to observe it and bring it in through the senses. And he's going to get to that problem because that very solution, observation, brings up a number of problems. He's going to come back to that, okay? So observation, not meditation, is the way you figure out how the world works. And I know lots of people like to say they do that. As the sciences which we now have do help us in finding our new works, so neither does the logic which we now have help us in finding new sciences. The logic now in use serves rather to fix and give stability to the errors which have their foundation and commonly receive notions than to help the search after truth. So it does more harm than good. The thing to understand that he's bringing in are elements of inductive and deductive reasoning. Logic, if you remember this when we talked about it earlier in the year, logic is a form of deductive reasoning. Mathematics is the extreme of it. So mathematics and logic are forms of deductive reasoning. They are basically working things out in thought. Okay? Observation is not logic. Now, one of the errors you don't want to make here in reading Bacon, Bacon is pushing for inductive reasoning at a time when deductive reasoning is the norm. In other words, read it in a source and then you know it. Don't go out and observe the world. That was his time period. What I would rather you do is not prize one form of thinking over the other. But what he's going to point out is the inherent weakness in deductive reasoning. And he points this out. Logic now serves, now in use, serves rather to fix and give stability to the errors. In other words, it's like adding math to faulty reasoning, to poor science. Working it out mathematically doesn't make it better. It makes it more regular and it solves internal errors to it, but it doesn't solve overall errors to it. So that's what logic was being used for in his own time period, for making it more internally consistent, but it's still erroneous. It's still making errors. He's saying observation is going to be more important for fixing ideas, for understanding new sciences, for understanding how the physical and biological and all those other worlds work. You must found it on observation. But again, I want to be careful with this. I don't want you to go overboard and misunderstand that deductive reasoning is somehow faulty. One form of reasoning is not inherently better than the other. One works better in certain areas, one works better in other areas. I've even mentioned in class that deductive reasoning is absolutely essential to physics today. It is, because so much of what's discovered in physics is discovered through mathematics. So understand, do not reject deductive reasoning, but understand in his time, it was dominating all of the sciences, and that was creating an enormous amount of problems. There are and can be only two ways of searching into and discovering the truth. This is where he sets out inductive and deductive. The one flies from the senses and particulars to the most general axioms. This is a bad synopsis of Plato. And from these principles, the truths which it takes for settled and immovable proceeds to judgment and to the discovery of middle axioms. In other words, I've read the sources, I understand Plato, so that's how that works. That's how that works. I learned from Plato. That's the wrong way to go about things. That is using Plato and other sources to work things out deductively. One of the sources of errors that was being used to create, or one of the sources for deductive reasoning that was creating so many problems, was misunderstandings of the Bible. If the Bible says this, then that must work that way. That is a poor application deductively of using the Bible to determine other fields. And you're going to see Bacon has a problem with that, okay, and he should. And this way is now in fashion. So what he's pointing out is that deductive reasoning was the primary mode of working, using the Bible, using Plato, using other texts to figure out how the real world is working. That's deductive reasoning gone bad. The other drives its axioms, in other words, its parameters, its discoveries, its principles, from the senses and particulars, rising from by a gradual and an unbroken ascent. So deductive reasoning starts from a principle up here, and that principle gets applied down to the particulars. Inductive reasoning observes the particulars and moves up very gradually and with modesty towards general principles that you have seen apply again and again and again. So inductive reasoning builds up. Deductive reasoning comes down. Okay? Let me jump up a bit because we're running out of time. And this is, I'll tell you this, in reading Bacon, it's shocking how much of what he wrote about has been shown in the works of two psychologists. And again, these are two people I've mentioned before, Kahneman and Tversky. So much of what Bacon writes about played out in Kahneman and Tversky's research. And that was on the psychology of errors. Why do people have errors? If you've heard about things like confirmation bias and other things, that's Kahneman and Tversky's work. So much of that is spelled out in Bacon, but without the kind of careful research that Kahneman and Tversky did. So the mind longs to spring up to positions of higher generalities. In other words, we like deductive reasoning. We like to look at something and then figure it out. He's going to really caution you against that. That's your brain going logically, not going by observation. But let me jump up a bit. The idols and false notions which have now put in possession of the human understanding. Notice again, this is a metaphor. It's like a demon possession. The idols were things you're falsely worshiping. They're now demons taking control of your mind. Maybe not your soul, but your mind. And let me jump into these and get through them. Idols of the tribe, idols of the cave, idols of the marketplace, and idols of the theater. Watch these the way they work, because boy are they true today as much as they ever were. They saturate human thinking and human understanding. And let me go through these somewhat quickly, and I do want you to understand them. And he mentions induction. He says, idols of the tribe have their foundation in human nature itself. This is a problem of just being human and the way we look at the world. By being human, we might look at the earth and think it's, oh my God, it's unfathomably large, but not according to the perspective of Jupiter. And you might look at, this bacteria and think, boy, this bacteria is so microscopically tiny, but not according to an amoeba. So just by being human and looking at things from our perspective of being human, we are distorting proportionality and importance and how things work. From our perspective, certain things are important on some magnitude or some size or whatever, but from a different perspective, those very things could either not matter at all or have a very different importance. Okay? Think about how we think about things like sun's rays and things like the importance of it, the threat of it, the good of it, all of that changes if you come at it from a different living thing's perspective or from a different perspective. There's actually a little thought experiment that Feynman used to work with his I believe his kids, look at the world from the perspective of, you know, that lamppost out the door. Look at the world from the perspective of that bug crawling on the... It's changing the perspective, and that is exactly what Bacon was talking about. And Feynman got Bacon. Okay, so idols of the cave are of the individual person. Okay, for everyone besides the errors common to human nature itself in general has a cave or den of his own. In other words, these are things from the way you look at the world, from your experience, from you as an individual. You, and you, how you look at the world is going to change according to who you are, according to you. And a very important thing, both with this idols of the tribe and idols of the cave, and with the other two, you cannot change the fact that you are a human being and you are that, you're Dougie or you're a person. But what you can do is become more aware of how you are biasing and how you are manipulating the world you perceive. You are doing it automatically. You are manipulating the world. That is your idol of that cave. You are doing that. Okay? You can't stop doing it. But what you can do is be aware of how it might be affecting your perceptions. Okay? And those are always part of just being human. Okay? And then he has idols of the marketplace. These are the idols you pick up from talking to other people, from conversing with people, from what you pick up from your friends, from the news. These are the things you pick up. The most obvious one recently is from all the stupidity that's been out there on the coronavirus and the pandemic. If you've seen the silliness that's risen up about some of the news about, you know, this is going to do this, and all of this is from the intercourse of common culture, of popular culture. You can't isolate yourself from that and suddenly live in an actual cave. So be aware how that might be affecting both your development of ideas, but also your perception of the reality around you. What you pay attention to and what suddenly matters to you is affected by the marketplace. In other words, the social world in which you live. Okay? And then the idols of the theater. This is the one that so many people want to deny exists, but boy does it. And these are ideologies. These are the value systems that we reviewed with political science. These are there and are going to distort how you pick up, again, phenomena throughout the world, but also how you organize and understand their importance, how you put them together into a total worldview. Your ideology will distort how you perceive the world, the factual, reality of it, and it will. But it will also distort how you place importance or how you value things or devalue things. These idols are constantly present in human perception. So I want to be very clear about this. All of these idols in Bacon are still as present as they ever were. I think if he were reborn and came back today, I think he would have a good cry because they are so overwhelming. Okay? And they develop so many of our ideas and how we refract the world. I'm going to hold it there with this video because this is going to be 20 minutes now. But I did go on with more things, and I would like you to please finish the Bacon reading. We are not going to write on Bacon, but if you really want to understand scientific reasoning and scientific reading, which I think is more important than it ever has been before, finish reading Bacon. Okay, it is eye-opening. It might not be written in the most engaging prose. It was written originally in Latin, like I mentioned. It's been translated into an English that's fairly approximate of Renaissance English. So it is a bit of a tough read at times, but it's just as pertinent now as it was back then. Okay, so go ahead and finish up Bacon, and I'll want you to spell out the 4 idols and think through how they're still applicable today. But read the rest, what he does with the rest of the reading. Okay, and that's 46, by the way. Well, from 46 on, what he does is he spells out how they work, and boy, is it applicable to today. Okay? All right, so I'll leave it there, guys. Best of luck with this. And then we're going to go on to Karl Popper, which is much easier to read. All right, take care.